the river, as we stand on the shore of the Jordan, I find that I'm drawn to this moment right between John and Jesus. This, I imagine this tension between John's nervousness and Jesus' assuredness. And as we watch, it's almost as if time could be suspended when John's sort of shaky fingers cup the water, and then Jesus submits himself to the water. This sort of space right there, before all the other stuff happens. And what must that have been like? To stand there, face to face with Jesus, with him consenting to John, with him submitting and yielding all that he is to another person. That space between them, it feels very vulnerable, very fragile. It feels very thin, almost as if you blinked, it would pass by. But it doesn't. And I recently read this Celtic understanding that there are places in the world, places between earth and heaven, where the veil that separates them is very thin. And that's the word they use. It's very thin. And it's not that God is more present in those places, because I don't believe that God is more present in one place than in another place. But rather that something about that thin spot invites us to be more present to God. To the God that's standing right before us, who's always with us. So these thin places are so ordinary, and yet they're so utterly holy also. So as John touches the face and the shoulders and the feet, because they did the whole body. So as John touches all of Jesus, he was acutely aware, probably for the very first time in his life, that he was holding on to something holy, something sacred, something of God. Because if you remember, a long, long time ago, priests were the only ones who could name what was holy. They were the only ones who could touch holy things. And they got to say who could and who could not. They held all the power. People like you and me, we couldn't possibly be that close to God. And John, he gets to be that close to God. With the mud and the mess and all that was there, the Jordan must have never, ever looked the same to John again. So Jesus, in some ways, Jesus and John together in some ways, in that joining, become sort of a thin spot in this world, a place where heaven and earth met. God in Jesus' baptism comes close. And we, with all of our shaking hands and everything, we get to draw near to God. That's the gift of baptism. We're promised in baptism that God is indeed very, very present. But today, I would say that we sort of expect God to show up there in the waters. But there's another thing we see here. This moment between Jesus and John is that the holy can be grasped in unexpected places also. And that in those unexpected places, we can experience God there. And that's the piece which is so intriguing, that John's in this spot with Jesus, and that Jesus invites us into the holy spot, because this is what he says. He says, let it be so, for it's proper for us. It's proper for not just Jesus to be there, but for John too. It's proper for them to be there together to fulfill the righteousness. So he invites John into the holy place. And I believe there are such moments where heaven and earth sort of brush against one another. And not just that they brush against one another, but we get to be that close. Because if we really take seriously what's going on here, that because Jesus was born into this world and came to dwell with us, that in some ways Jesus has baptized every crevice of this world. I think that probably a lot of us can point to moments where we felt God's presence. Maybe in the church and maybe outside of the church. Moments where we felt something holier. That something about that moment allowed for us to feel like God was almost touchable. Those kind of moments where God, despite all reason and rationale, makes the unholy holy. And I've often said that while I can't explain in words, the day that my children were baptized, I experienced baptism in a whole different way. It was sort of the simultaneous strong and fragile moment. But I was thinking about this holy time. And honestly, one of the holiest moments of my life was a moment when I knew that I would get divorced. Not that God ordained it or baptized it, but that God was in it and was that close and could cleanse it. God totally undomesticates holiness, unleashes his presence into the whole world. Which means that yesterday, one of the thinnest places on this planet was probably a sidewalk in Arizona. Where Representative Giffords and 12 others, including a 9-year-old boy, were shot. Holy water yesterday may have looked like someone actually holding that person like they themselves are actually holy water. Like they are the most sacred thing on the planet to someone for just a few moments. Because in that moment, we know that Jesus drew close, and we know that Jesus baptized that moment with his tears. The moments in life when we stand as John does, unable to fully comprehend what's actually going on, those are the times when Jesus says, stay. It's necessary for you to be here. Don't refuse and don't run and don't say you aren't good enough to hold the water. Because I need you to help me cleanse. And I need you to help me love. And I need you to help me heal. Because I have to tell you that last night, I had a sermon all written yesterday. I was ahead of the game. And last night, I struggled when I heard that news. And I remember that a year ago, almost, was when tragedy struck Haiti. And then I started thinking about all the yuck in the world. And in some ways, maybe God made me start thinking about how that fits in with Jesus' baptism, with something that seems so pure and holy and cleansing. Where's all that fit? So today, I'm glad that Jesus was baptized with the dirty hands of John. And I'm glad that Jesus was baptized in muddy water, with no ceremony. Because at least on this morning, I'm reminded that it wasn't clean. That Jesus was baptized into a big, giant mess. And that messy places are God's places too, are thin places too. And baptism is about, hear me please, that baptism is about being cleansed and being renewed and being forgiven. And it's also about Jesus choosing to be baptized into the mess of this world. A muddy river or a crystal clear baptismal font, or a bloody sidewalk or a sterile hospital bed. The perfect newborn baby or the grave site that was dug too soon. Those are all places where Jesus is. The baptismal water symbolizes life and newness. And when the weight of the world seems too much to bear, the weight of baptism is more. The gift of God is more. The love of Christ is more. And the breath of the Spirit is more, making these thin places all over the place. Reminding us that the holy might be as close as the very spot you are in. So this week, I pray that God's baptismal waters will thin out the thickness between you and the holy. And that being refreshed by them, you stay and you pour holy water. Amen.